Please.
So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this event. It is co-hosted by the Icelandic government and Perspectives. Here today we are going to hear about new invented technology, technology that has been implemented in Iceland since 2012 actually, and we think that we are in a way, we have the front runners in this aspect in Iceland. Although the Icelandic government hasn't set formal strategy or plans on how to utilize this new technology, that is something that is on the way, I would say. We have started it and we have to look into it, how that relates to all our climate goals and how we can support new technology in this aspect. So, without no further ado, I would like to give the floor to Matthias.
Thank you very much. And yes, it's also a pleasure to welcome you to our event together with the Government of Iceland and with also the University of Freiburg. I will say a few words on a research project that we are undertaking together, which is looking into policy instruments and ethics aspects of carbon dioxide removal, of which, of course, direct air capture and storage is one example. And so it will be interesting to have that conceptual, academic, and the real-world application and development from both the technological side, but also the practical and policy side here in this event. I should add that initially we announced this event to include a presentation from Sabina Reinecke, our colleague from the University of Freiburg. Unfortunately, she can't be here with us today, but we have the pleasure to add to our speakers Claire Tyson, who's also part of our consortium, and we'll hear from her on their shared scenarios for future scale up. So with that, I'd ask you to go to the next slide. Next slide, yes. So we seem to be having a bit of an issue. Yes, there we go. Okay, so that's the flyer. Again, next slide, please. Next slide. Okay, so this is just a quick overview over the research project. We have 5 work packages, which include stakeholder engagement. We feel it's important to have conversations like this one, but also with various types of stakeholders outside of the UN halls on these emerging topics. We have elaborated on principles that may guide development of policies, so governance principles. We are looking at their distribution of responsibility, again, by Claire Plyson here at the table. We are going to develop furthermore concrete criteria to discuss policy instrument design and their suitability within the context of the and then we will look into 3 case study examples, which include agroforestry, so also land use techniques, as well as bioenergy or biomass-based carbon capture and storage, which achieves renewables, as well as, and this is what we're doing today, direct carbon capture and storage. And altogether, basically, we hope to bring together the conceptual and the concrete. Next slide, please. Actually, I forgot to mention, you can see our partners in the research project listed on this slide. Next slide. Yes. It appears there's a bit of a delay with the slide change. So maybe I should say next slide when I'm halfway done.
It just takes time for internet to switch to another slide so you can continue talking on the switch.
Okay, so I have to anticipate what is on the next slide. I think it says something about policy principles. We feel quite strongly that there is a contribution that academia can make in the conversations that are happening here. We see there's different contexts in which we can identify applicable normative guidance, principles that are applicable in this emerging governance space. So some of them come from general environmental governance, some come from the climate governance context, the UNFCCC here, and some are explicitly targeting carbon dioxide removal as a field where there is emerging literature also that we can look into and translate perhaps towards the policy instruments that we see emerge here in these halls. And I'm going to touch briefly on the Article 6.4 guidance, which came out, well, it's recommendations for guidance, so a more preliminary stage, which came out last week. And there's also, as you might know, a development in the European Union for the certification of carbon dioxide removal with, basically the purpose is not yet very clear, so we have to watch that space, and it's interesting to be able to explore how normative dimensions play into that and how perhaps academia can help structure these conversations. So I'm not sure, it seems the slides are completely stuck. Did you try to wing it? A few concrete examples on the imaginary slides. Examples for such policy principles. And one is in the context of mitigation and mitigation. It is not entirely clear, and there's a conflicting narratives around how governance principles related for that. For example, there is a very strong concern that talking about carbon dioxide removal itself causes an erosion of the willingness to tackle emissions and reduce emissions. But on the other hand, carbon dioxide removal is already a part of our plans. It is already built into the scenarios of how we address climate change. And so not doing carbon dioxide removal on the flip side would actually perversely result in such what is sometimes called moral hazard. So this is an issue where one needs to have a balance and needs to be considering both possibilities. So strengthening mitigation ambition is perhaps one area when we can explore how normative aspects play into CBR discussion. Another one is certainly, it's perhaps a cluster around environmental integrity, effects on sustainable development, social and environmental effects. And this is not necessarily speaking to direct air carbon capture and storage, but also just generally speaking, the whole category. There's big concerns around biomass use in the case of bioenergy-based CCS removals. And so that is clearly a space that one needs to watch. In regards to the Article 6.4 draft guidance, there is some reference to those issues, certainly to environmental integrity in the sense that the carbon. But I'll finish that sentence. But some fear that the text is not sufficiently strong with regard to sustainable development aspects right now. This is not a new issue. This has been the case already under the Clean Development Mechanism. There has been a lot of contentious discussion around that because, of course, at the end of the day, it is each country's prerogative to say which are the priorities that need to be pursued in engaging in climate action, the priorities with regard to side effects, such as unsustainable development. So I think if you're in this room, you're probably very familiar with the definition of carbon dioxide removal. I put it on a slide nonetheless, but I will not talk to it very much. Basically, the point is that carbon has to move net out of the atmosphere into durable storage. That's the essence of it. Next slide. Thank you. Perfect. Again, meaningful policies require considering several objectives. Next slide. And we have a paper on the governance principles where you can read up on what we labeled A to Z of governance principles. So it's a pretty comprehensive, I would hope, list. And it's I'm not going to get into all of these because that's going to be too long. But like I said, we drew from 3 governance contexts to identify those issues. Next slide, please. I already touched on this one example of mitigation ambition. Concretely, this could mean that removals need to be systematically considered in the NDCs as well as in the long-term strategies, which is currently not really the case, I would argue. Policies should not weaken emissions reductions, but rather ideally strengthen them. And there needs to be an alignment as over time, as with mitigation overall, between the ambition that we express with, for example, net zero targets and the action that is actually taking place. Next slide, please. Equity is certainly a very important point, and I'm not going to elaborate on this because we have an entire presentation afterwards. Next slide. And I mentioned the Article 6.4 guidance. We will, by the way, upload the slides on the UNFCCC side event list, so you will be able to get them and also access the link to that guidance through that slide here. The guidance, essentially what it offers is a list of additional requirements that removals need to consider in addition to those that Article 6.4 guidance provides for anyways. So there's some more stringency attached, including in particular for dealing with non-permanence or reversals, re-emission of the CO2. Next slide. I also mentioned the carbon dioxide removal certification mechanism, which is currently under development. We expect this to come out at the end of this month, so stay tuned. There has been a leak. I'm not going to go into detail on the contents of that leak. If you find it, then you may explore what it contains, but perhaps just as a teaser, it appears that there is already a few challenges, let's call them, in terms of how these removals are characterized, defined, and the purpose of this entire mechanism has not been really addressed. So with that, basically, the Commission seems to say, well, the form does not necessarily follow the function, but rather the inverse. Next slide, please. So I'll keep it at that. Public policy in general contains normative dimension, and I think it's worth exploring that dimension a bit more systematically. I think academia can play a part in that. We can try our best. Governance of CBR needs careful deliberation. We need more conversation like the one we're having now, and we need to balance across these normative dimensions, across these governance principles. We need to have balance because trade-offs are inevitable. And you can find more information also again under the link provided in the slide deck on the CBR COVID project. With that, I will hand over to Claire.
Hello. Can you hear me? Yes. Okay. I don't have the best voice for this, but we'll try. It's that very loud room. So, hi, I'm Claire. I'm going to be presenting on behalf of myself and other colleagues, Gaurav and Carl, on our work looking at fair shares for carbon dioxide removal. The reason being, we know in the IPCC's 1.5 degree pathways that we need carbon dioxide removal, but of course the question is, who should be doing this? Who is responsible for this burden of taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere? And as a starting point, what's really important is to identify what are actually pathways that are compatible with the Paris Agreement. So if you'll bear with me, I have a few slides to just talk through the thinking we've gone through to understand what pathways are consistent with this goal, and then I'll dive into how do we look at carbon dioxide removal in those pathways. So just as a reminder, I'm sure you all know this off by heart, but this is Article 2.1a, 2.1c, another hot topic. Check out the finance room. 2.1a of the Paris Agreement. And I've put in bold some words that I really want you to pay special attention to. So we want to hold the increase in global average temperature to well below 2 degrees and pursue efforts to limit temperature increase to 1.5, recognizing that this will reduce the risks and impacts of climate change. So how do we convert those bold words into pathways? Well, a little slightly technical discussion on likelihoods now. So the IPCC has calibrated language that it uses to convert from probabilities into likelihood statements. And this is important because it allows us to convert those words that we just saw in the Paris Agreement goal into probabilities that we use to understand pathways. You might have heard of the previous goal, the previous temperature goal to limit warming below 2 degrees. This was agreed in Cancun a while back, before we understood how bad 2 degrees would really be. And this was interpreted by the IPCC as meaning likely below 2 degrees. So there's a 66% or more probability of limiting warming to 2 degrees in that table. And you can see what that means in that table. Some of my colleagues have taken a look at what likelihoods apply to pathways that are consistent with the Paris Agreement, and there's a paper there that I can recommend you having a look at if you really love probabilities and want to understand more about the Paris Agreement. It's a very good paper. So I'll step through now the 3 main criteria that are in the Paris Agreement and how we translate those into probabilities and pathways. So number 1, pursuing efforts to limit temperature rise to 1.5. This we interpret, and the IPCC has interpreted this as pathways that are not likely, so a less than 67% likelihood, to ever exceed 1.5 throughout the 21st century. Next criteria, well below, holding temperature rise well below 2. That means you shouldn't be going anywhere near 2 degrees over the whole century. And that, in the IPCC's calibrated language, translates to a very likely chance of holding warming below 2 degrees, so 90% likelihood. And then the third criteria is encapsulated in Article 4.1 of the Paris Agreement, and this is to balance emissions and removals in the second half of the century. And this translates to achieving net zero greenhouse gases in the second half of the century. And that's important because actually, if you achieve net zero greenhouse gases, you actually lead to a slight decline in temperatures over time. And that can have really important ramifications in the longer term for things like sea level rise. If you only achieve net zero CO2 globally, you will have much worse sea level rise in the long term than if you achieve net zero greenhouse gases. So that's why that's a really important part. So what we did is what my colleagues did is they mapped these different probabilities to understand which of the IPCC scenarios are consistent with the Paris Agreement temperature goal. So on the bottom you have the probability of exceeding 2 degrees, and on the y-axis you have the probability of exceeding 1.5. On those two criteria, 90% chance of below 2, and a greater than 33% chance of limiting warming to 1.5. And in this spread, you can see all of the scenarios that the IPCC, or a bunch of the scenarios the IPCC assessed in its recent AR6 report, and those green ones there are the so-called 1.5 low, no, and limited overshoot pathways. And you can see that actually in that green cluster, most of them meet both of those two important criteria. And that means that there's a lot of pathways there that are consistent with the Paris Agreement's temperature goal. And these two parts of the goal are part and parcel of the same goal. If you limit warming to well below 2 degrees, you pursue efforts to limit warming to 1.5. And it's not two different goals. It's not either 2 or 1.5. They're really part of the same thing. So what we did is we took these pathways that are consistent with the Paris Agreement, and we took a look at what does carbon dioxide removal look like in those pathways. And one question that came up is, should all of this be allocated across all countries? What are the different types of, what is carbon dioxide removal actually doing in those pathways? And in this plot, you can see that on the left-hand side, only about 20% of the carbon removal is being used before achieving net zero. So it's helping you to get your net emissions down quickly to net zero. But the lion's share of carbon dioxide removal is happening after you've achieved net zero CO2. We then took that blue box and split it up further into what's needed to maintain net zero CO2, what's needed to maintain net zero GHGs in the kind of peachy colour, and then in the red, what's additional to that. And that's important, or we think it's relevant, because you can then look at this and say, well, which parts of the carbon dioxide removal in these pathways are needed according to the Paris Agreement. And you could argue that these three green boxes are what's consistent with the Paris Agreement. So getting down to net zero CO2, maintaining net zero CO2, maintaining net zero greenhouse gases then, and that additional deployment, it might be useful, for example, for limiting impacts, but it's not necessarily required by the Paris Agreement goals. So we took those green boxes of carbon removal and we looked at how does this then get split across the world, and you could divide it across the world in different ways. What the models using the IPCC do is they share it around the world based on a least cost approach. Where is it most cost effective to deploy it? But we looked at what is actually could be considered a fair allocation across the world. So we looked at responsibility, so which countries have emitted the most over time. And those countries that have emitted the most over time, you could argue, should hold more of the burden. So the US, if you look at the green and the purple there, those are both responsibility-based metrics. The US gets most of the share there. Capability, on the other hand, you could argue that governments that have more money, greater GDP, they might be responsible for doing more carbon dioxide removal, seeing as we know it's quite an expensive thing to do. And so there we have two capability. I won't go into the details of how we set these things up, but if you're interested, then we have a paper from a few years ago that went into how you might set some of these quantifications up. And just on my last slide, this is actually that paper from a few years ago. We looked at what does this mean for what we need to do in the near term. This is really relevant for processes like the global stock take, where we're taking stock of where we are in this decade. What does that mean for what countries are obliged to do under the Paris Agreement in the future if they keep on going where they're going? A slightly complicated graph, but what we did is we plotted, these are the slightly older pathways from the SR 1.5, and we plotted emissions in 2030 for each country, for each of the major emitters you can see in the key there, their emissions in 2030 against what their fair share of carbon dioxide removal would be on the y-axis. And you can see some kind of rough straight lines which show that the more each country emits in 2030, the more of a carbon dioxide removal burden it would have by the end of the century. And of course this has important implications for intergenerational equity, for example, that it will be our kids and their kids that will be cleaning up our mess. And you can see, for example, the United States there, the cross on the line is where the former NDC, this is slightly old, took us a really big burden for the United States to hold for carbon dioxide removal. Yeah, that's the end of that. Thank you for listening. I'm not sure who Axel next.
Okay, so now after having looked at the global perspective, we look at the perspective that relates Iceland, direct air capture technologies and Article 6. Matthias Honegger has already mentioned the policy challenges for Article 6 and carbon dioxide removal, and I will now try to look into something concrete. And we have fortunately representatives of Climeworks with us. Climeworks is the world leader in direct air capture technologies. It is running the largest plant that currently captures CO2 from the air with 4,000 tons per year capacity. A new plant is being constructed that will multiply that by 10 times. And of course, we also have a very beautiful permanent storage technology, Carbfix, and of course we'll hear the presentation about that technology later. So that means we have an excellent technology base for removal and permanent storage. We have a host country, Iceland, that expects to overachieve its NDC target and that has signed a declaration of intent with Switzerland to potentially sell ITMOs, international emission credits, to Switzerland. And Switzerland is a country that is a pioneer in Article 6. It has a very well developed program. It has an NDC that explicitly states that about 35 million tons of CO2 are to be acquired from overseas. It is also very interested to issue ITMOs for use in the voluntary carbon market. And of course, it is the partner of Iceland under this joint declaration of intent. So that links to the different possibility to apply carbon markets under Article 6. So the compliance market used for NDC, the voluntary market, the use for company or other private targets, and of course the important thing is that the carbon credit under Article 6 undergoes the so-called corresponding adjustment. That means there's no double counting. Anything that is sold by Iceland will be added to the Icelandic emissions balance. Now, of course, how to structure such an Article 6 pilot. So the first option is that the ITMOs that the use of the Climeworks and Carbfix technology generate are sold for the use under the Swiss NDC. So the first step, of course, is to get an authorization from Iceland for the use of those ITMOs towards NDCs. Those of you who follow the Article 6 negotiations know that it's now being debated at what point in time does this have to be done and what is the exact process for it. But we hope that, of course, the negotiations will actually achieve a result. So there is one sub-option that the ITMOs are being sold through the Click Foundation Switzerland. That's a very interesting public-private partnership that has a lot of experience already in designing Article 6 pilot transactions. One needs to say that the process is relatively cumbersome. One needs to make first a request of a so-called mitigation activity idea note. That is then checked. If it's found to be interesting by Click, then a so-called mitigation activity design document or MAD is being developed, but this takes time and is costly. The second option thus is a direct sale to the Swiss government, but of course Switzerland so far doesn't have the processes in place to enable this. So it would take more time to actually set up that sub-option. The second generic option would be to sell the ITMOs on the voluntary market. That would mean one would need an authorization for other uses, and of course now one would need a government, a receiving government that is willing to channel those ITMOs through to Climeworks for eventual use on the voluntary market. One needs to say that Climeworks has been selling credits already now on the voluntary market, but has been doing this entirely on its own basis. So the first sub-option would be that the Swiss government receives the ITMOs and then forwards them to Climeworks. As said, the Swiss government has declared its intent to make ITMOs available to the voluntary market, so that seems a realistic option. Of course, one could become even more innovative. One could try to emulate the unilateral option that we've seen under the clean development mechanism, where we had sellers, but we didn't have actually the transfer through a buying government. So that would mean one would have a direct transfer from the Icelandic government to an account that is operated by Climeworks. The negotiations currently would give the possibility to do that. Of course, we need to see how the outcome will be, but that, of course, would be a very interesting option. And then, of course, those ITMOs that Climeworks receives either directly or through the Swiss government would be sold on the voluntary market, and the voluntary market user would cancel those ITMOs. The third option would be to go through Article 6.4. Article 6.4, of course, undergoes international oversight through the supervisory body, so one first needs to develop a methodology that is then approved by the supervisory body. Then one needs to make the request for registration of the activity, and that, of course, is a process that will take time. And as you've, of course, probably heard already, the supervisory body in its meeting last week was unable to decide on the methodological approaches, so that means we'll need at least another year in which this basis can be laid. So it will probably take 2 or 3 or even more years under Article 6.4 is actually eligible. So that, of course, means how would one work on the methodological side? There are a few methodologies available on the voluntary market. Mostly they relate to carbon capture and storage, not direct air capture. We have, of course, the guidance from the clean development mechanism, how to do geological storage, which are the safeguards that could be translated. But yeah, the voluntary market stuff so far is not really convincing. We have an approach by Climeworks and Carbfix that will definitely be presented later today on a methodology under the ISO standard, but we need still to see how it can be translated. Of course, there are further ongoing approaches. There's the so-called CCS Plus initiative that also covers direct air capture. It's a modular framework for methodologies under the VERA system, but of course that means it would still have to be brought up to an Article 6.2 framework. And then there is an initiative that is called the International Initiative for Article 6 Methodology Tools that tries to enable the continued use of CDM methodologies under Article 6 with certain elements being replaced by those tools. That, for example, could be done also in the context of the CDM guidance relating to the geological storage. So what one would need to do now for the pilot is to blend the existing methodologies to find those that are really credible and which are actually attractive for both Iceland and Switzerland to use under a potential 6.2 collaboration. Then, of course, we have accounting issues. So far, direct air capture and storage is not yet included in the IPCC inventory guidelines. That's a big barrier for actually ensuring that the accounting is done properly in the long term. So our solution would be a parallel approach that the governments of Iceland, Switzerland, and maybe other countries interested in the technology make a submission under the IPCC that the inventory guidance is being revised. This has been done in the past. For example, there was the wetland supplement in 2013, and that, of course, already related to capture and storage by natural processes. The process of the IPCC takes time. It would need at least 2 years to get this through, so one would have to act quickly. But of course, we need to have the full reporting in place from the time when the biennial transparency reports are being done, and that's from 2024 onwards. So if one would act quickly, it might still be possible. With that, I would like to thank you. These are elements that we would hope could bring the basis for the first Article 6.2 transaction for direct air capture. Thank you.
So I believe I'm next. Can you hear me well? Thank you. So while Matthias is bringing up the slides, I want to thank the Icelandic government, Perspectives, and University of Freiburg for putting this event together. It is now my pleasure to introduce our company, Climeworks, the world's leading direct air capture company, in the next few minutes. Next slide, please. Yes. So I don't want to go into this again. Claire has laid this out very eloquently already. Let me just say that what we propose to use direct air capture for is to defossilize, so provide CO2 streams for products where we need CO2 to neutralize unavoidable emissions and to realize net negative emissions. We absolutely have to have more ambition on emissions reductions, and negative emissions or carbon removal is just there to neutralize unavoidable and historic emissions, because what we are doing is really, really hard. We are chasing 420 parts per million. Next slide, please. So this is us. This is Climeworks. We have been in existence since 2009. We've already realized 15 direct air capture projects. We're about 300 now. That slide might be 2 months old, so we're hiring like crazy. We have raised 810 million, and what we're really proud of is that we have already more than 100,000 hours or several 100,000 hours of operational experience, and we are at about 10% cradle-to-grave life cycle emissions. Why is that important? If you are in the business of removing CO2 from the atmosphere, you better make sure that your emissions, your own emissions, are very, very low, and these include building the plants, running the plants, and recycling them at the end, and we are only selling the net part of what we remove from the air as removals. Next slide. This is our current project. This is called Mammoth. Last year in September we opened Orca, that Matthias already mentioned, the last direct air capture plant in the world, and this is, Mammoth is 10 times the size of that. So that's already being built, the foundations are being laid, the process hall in the middle is already there. Winter is approaching in Iceland, so we hope to do a lot of work inside before we then continue on the outside next year. Next slide. This is our scale-up roadmap. So 15 projects. Now we are in our second generation of technology. We're now scaling up. currently building Mammoth. The next step would then be in around 2027, so every 2 to 3 years to do another 10x. And then we want to go into the multi-megaton range, and obviously our aim is to become, get to the gigaton scale to really make them to really become climate relevant in around 2050. Next slide, please. So this is basically the high-level policy picture. This is why we're here. Maybe a bit of history quickly. The first step was about enabling the conditions, having legally binding net zero goals, because if you have that, then policymakers know or can turn to their unavoidable emissions and from that calculate the amount of removals they need to achieve net zero. Obviously, we do need eventually a compliance framework to realize that, and then we can transit from avoided emissions to a system where we only have emissions and removals, because at net zero there are no more offsets. You either have an emission and that has to be balanced by a removal, but there's nothing more to offset. Obviously, the second pillar is unlocking funding. We are very fortunate that in the US we have the DOE Direct Air Capture Program and the 45Q tax credit, which is a massive effort by the US government to buy down the cost of direct air capture, so thank you. And this is also very, very important because what we do works a bit like electric cars or wind and solar. It's a technology. The more we build, the more the cost will come down. We have done this over and over again. But we need to accelerate that, and for that we need infrastructure. And the last pillar is, drive integrity, what we're doing here. We need standards, we need methodologies. We do need to agree on what the removal is. Matthias offered the definition, in short, CO2 from the air into durable storage. And that's also maybe the hand over to Edda, because Carbfix, our partner, is there to achieve the durable storage. But I told them, are we taking questions now or later? How do you want to do it?
I think, so we caught up a little bit, I think, on time. So if there are any clarifying questions, just really clarifying, please raise your hand. Otherwise, we will move on right away and we'll have a discussion at the end.
Good, I seem to have been clear. So Edda, over to you.
Thank you. Hi everyone. I'm going to continue where Christoph left off with durable storage. So I'm Edda, I'm the CEO of Carbfix, and we've been developing a technology that permanently stores CO2 since 2006. And I'm going to explain in more detail about what it is that this method entails. So next slide, please. So what we do is that we turn captured CO2 into stone on the ground through a natural process that happens in 2 years by use of our technology. This is a process that's been going on in nature for millions of years. It's part of the global carbon cycle, and mineralizing CO2 is nature's way of permanently storing CO2, regulating CO2 levels in the atmosphere over geologic timescales. But as we've emitted so much CO2 into the atmosphere, these natural processes that happen slowly, they can't keep up. But we can implement technology to speed up those exactly same reactions. And that's what we do with our technology. We do not necessarily turn CO2 into stone, but we assist with creating the conditions that allow those processes to happen much faster than they otherwise would. And you can see there on the slide, and I also have some of these rock samples here with me, a piece of basalt. Basalts are one of the most common rock types on Earth. We find them on all the continents, majority of the ocean floor, and you can see embedded in the basalt are these white specks, crystals, and this is mineralized CO2. So next slide, please. I want to explain a bit how we go about the process. We've already touched upon emission reductions versus removals. And when it comes to injecting CO2, we can do it from both processes. So that's what we are doing. We are both taking CO2 captured from point sources, hard-to-abate sectors, etc. But then for several years now, we've also been working with Climeworks and take CO2 removed from the atmosphere. And then we go about the injection and mineralization in exactly the same way, independently on how the CO2 is sourced. We take the CO2 and actually we dissolve it in water while we are injecting it into the subsurface. So essentially, it's sparkling water that we are injecting into favorable rock formations. And then these wonderful chemical reactions start happening within the subsurface between the bedrock that contains specific metals, calcium, magnesium, and iron, naturally. And these then react with the CO2 that we have injected, and new minerals, carbonates, they form, and this process just takes 2 years. And once the minerals have formed, they are stable over geologic timescales. And actually, already these processes are storing over 99% of all carbon that exists on Earth. These amounts are already being stored in the rocks under our feet. We just tend not to think about that. As I've already mentioned, we started developing the technology in 2006. It was a pure R&D project, an idea on paper back then, but we injected the first ton 10 years ago, so we're celebrating that anniversary these days. And since 2014, we have continuously been injecting CO2 commercially, first from one of our large geothermal power plants in Iceland, and then, as already mentioned, since 2017, from direct air capture as well. And we've been adding on more projects since then and new industries. So next slide, please. I saw that my colleague is passing along the rocks, but to explain what you see there, it's also on the slide here. So this is sort of a before and after of what this looks like. You can see before we inject into young porous formations. There's a lot of space down there in the pores. And then gradually, as we have the reactions taking place, the pores and fractures, they fill up with these carbonate minerals, and you can see then what it looks like afterwards. And then once the rock samples come to you can see it here as well. So next slide, please. So our mission is to significantly contribute to climate recovery through worldwide scaling of our technology, in addition to further developing it. We've taken it considerably far already. We've proven that it works under specific conditions, but we know we can do even more. So while we work on scaling in partnerships with others that are either removing or capturing CO2 emissions, we also continue to innovate to bring the technology into even more regions where it's not applicable yet. And an example of that is, for example, using seawater. As I mentioned, we dissolve the CO2 in water while we inject it. We don't lose the water, it's a carrier for the CO2 until the mineralization has taken place. But still, we know that in many parts of the world, water is scarce. So by demonstrating that we can use seawater, we can, for example, unlock large potential in countries like India. So this is a very exciting R&D project that we have been actually working on for quite some time. And as we speak, we are actually drilling the well for the demonstration itself. So we will start the injection to prove it out in the field, not just under lab conditions a few weeks from now. So stay tuned for those results. Next slide. So I would say that our technology offers a considerable competitive advantage. Firstly, as already has been mentioned here, I mean, it's been certified, and that's of course extremely important for transparency. But then, as I mentioned, the CO2, once it mineralizes, it's gone forever. The storage is permanent. The minerals are stable for millennia. It's 100% safe. No risk of leaks because we have immediate solubility trapping of the CO2 because we dissolve it in water, and then within 2 years it's mineralized and stone doesn't leak, so no worries there. It's cost effective. We go about the injection through different types of infrastructure than, for example, the offshore project in the North Sea. Firstly, we do things on shore, saves a lot of cost. And then we inject through a network of shallow wells compared to a fewer number of deeper wells, and this also saves some cost. We run the process under lower operating pressures, saves on the energy required to run the process. And then because the CO2 mineralizes, there is different type of need for long-term monitoring than for supercritical storage, for example. So all of this really adds to the cost effectiveness of the method. And last but not least, the technology is scalable. I mentioned that basalts and similar rock formations are one of the most common rock types on Earth. And if we look at the storage capacity found in those formations, it's way more than we will ever need for climate actions. It's more than 100,000 gigatons. Of course, not all of that can be unlocked. I'm not saying that, but the potential is absolutely there. Next slide, please. And here you can see a map that we have on our website, so indicating where on the planet you can expect to find the favorable formations, where we can implement our process to mineralize CO2. And so it's at carbfix.com/atlas. You can browse around, it's interactive, so take a look and see if there is some basalt in your backyard. Next slide. As this session here is focusing on policy, a regulatory framework, I just wanted to touch upon the regulatory framework that applies to CO2 injection, whether it's precipitation storage or the way we do it, mineralization. And this is done from a European perspective. Generally, I would say that what is important is to try to make the policies, the regulations that we are relying on for climate action as technology agnostic as possible. Some of the regulations that we are working with, they are quite old, not up to date with the current state-of-the-art technologies, and certainly not up to date with how tomorrow's technology will look like. So I would very much like to see that whenever policy and regulations, laws are being updated, let's try to be sort of foresighted and be as technology agnostic as possible. This will help tremendously with scale-up of new technologies. In Europe, injection of CO2 falls under the CCS directive. So we have to go through environmental impact assessment to get an injection license for CO2 injection, independently of whether the CO2 comes from point source emissions or the atmosphere. So this is something that we go about, and these processes they can take long. We've actually, for the past few years, been in very close collaboration with the Icelandic government on how we can integrate the environmental impact assessment process with the permitting process, so that it's not done, one after the other, which would take too long if we want to scale up quickly. And it's been great to see sort of the results of that. So we could do even better, but still, we are gradually getting there. And this is, of course, very important, not just for our technology, but for other technologies. So I want to stress this again, as technology agnostic as possible, and we have to shorten these processes that all projects have to go through. They are simply not in line with the urgency of action we have to take. So next slide. I believe I'm getting to the end of my presentation. And I mean, of course, this is why we're all here, how we act and invest now and in the very next few years. It's going to profoundly affect life on our planet for our kids, grandkids, for the next 1,000 years. So let's continue the good work, scale up all these great technologies that are existing, and we are certainly willing to do our part there. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for your presentation. I believe there's plenty of questions in the room. So if you do have a question, I will come to you with a microphone. Feel free to raise your hand. Yes, perfect. I already see a few.
Thank you very much. Tim Dixon, IAGFG. Axel, thank you very much for highlighting the IPCC greenhouse gas guidelines gap on BACs. I've been trying to highlight that as well. How do we get them? How do we get the task force inventories to put this on their work programme?
A very pragmatic question to Axel.
Yes, thank you. Well, there's a process. Governments can submit requests to the IPCC. Of course, the Bureau of the IPCC is dealing with those. The more governments are pushing this, the more likely it is that it is being dealt with rapidly and effectively. As I said, there are historical precedents. The wetland edition that was done in 2013, so nobody can say it's not possible. It is well possible, but the IPCC, of course, is a machinery that's almost as complex as the UNFCCC, and it needs to be pushed. And I would hope that the understanding that we need these technologies is bringing governments to underwrite such a push.
Thanks. I'm not sure who was next. I will go to you.
Thank you. I'm David Vaughan, a senator from the Australian federal government. Eda, I'm guessing that the rock formations that you need, is it limestone? So you're using calcium carbonate. Is the depositing function?
We are creating calcium carbonate. We are not using limestone formations for the injection. It's basalt, other similar formations.
So where does the calcium come from?
It comes from the basalt.
A bit of chemistry. Thanks.
Always good to have chemistry and we get discussions.
Hello, Olivier Lejeune from Specialist Media Quantum Community Intelligence. Just curious about costs for each respective part, the air capture part and the injection part. Yeah, do you have like current costs and also which portion is more expensive?
Yeah, so I'll start with the cost for the removal part. As Eda said, there are basically two sources of CO2. One is point source captured CO2 that's using the fossil CO2, but that's not achieving a removal because it's not coming from the atmosphere. And I'm not an expert here, so I'm not going to comment on the cost. For us, for direct air capture, so from the air into, to Carbfix, so for that part, imagine we are a solar panel provider in the 1990s. So currently the technology is at a cost of 600 to 800. It varies on the project and where it is, etc. And we foresee that if we can get to the multi-megatron realm, we can get this down to below 200. And then maybe as we go into the gigaton realm, we can see that we can arrive at 100. We don't think more is possible, but it depends on us scaling this up. It's like building cars. Economies of scale are usual. If we don't do that, it's not gonna happen. Yeah, and over to you, Eda.
Thank you. Just to further elaborate, for point source capture, it varies a lot from industry to industry. From approximately $20 per ton up to 100 or even more. But for storage, at least Carbfix type of storage, it's the cheapest part of the value chain. Again, depending on various project parameters, size of project, and other factors. The cost currently ranges from somewhere between 5 to 25, maybe, something like that per ton. So very cost effective, as I already explained.
And maybe another addition from my side, not strictly on the cost, but we already have a situation where this is a seller's market, and this is going to remain a scarce good And the objective here is to, get to the volumes we know already we will need. Otherwise, we won't make the goals of the Paris Agreement. So this is not a question of cost as much as of volumes, and that is also the bottleneck. Can we get to scale in time?
Thanks. On the numbers, we have the gentleman in the room.
I'm Toshi Sakamoto from Institute of Energy Economics of Japan. I have a quick question to Eda. One of the slides said you continued commercial operations since 2014. My question is, who pays for this, for what purpose, or has this become already a voluntary carbon credit?
So the injections we started in 2014, it's in relation to capture from one of our largest geothermal power plants in Iceland. So it's the operator of that power plant that will pay for the construction of the infrastructure and so forth. It's not creating credits, it's for reduced emissions, which goes into the national inventory of Iceland, and of course, as a part of contributes to the climate goals of the company in question, On Power.
Yes. Who's the next?
The moderator needs to tell me who's next.
Thank you so much for a really interesting presentation. My question is really for Axel. So, given that the way I see it, your technology is really quite special because it's permanent. And you can't say that in the same way about some of the other carbon dioxide removal technology, or they're much more contentious for environmental reasons. So your technology is really special. So shouldn't we, under Article 6, find a way to preserve these credits if they turn into credits for the truly hard to abate sectors? Because once you make them available on the market, anybody can buy them, well, in principle. You can be a luxury brand, fossil fuel company, with a terrible environment. You can imagine the worst case scenarios. Is there not some argument for creating a special provision so that these credits are reserved for the truly hard to abate sectors?
The question was for...
So reserving credits, in my view, doesn't make sense. If we have companies who are willing to buy the luxury brand, they can pay the higher prices and they can do it right now. So Climeworks on its tiny voluntary carbon market niche currently is getting prices of over $600 per ton removed. So if we have it under Article 6 with the full international backing, the price would even be higher. And we see many technology companies from the US actually wanting to buy such credits. So I have no issue with the willingness to pay. The question is, will the willingness to pay such high sums also exist if the upscaling plans, the gigatons, will materialize? So it's a bit of a chicken and egg problem. We have a small niche with very high willingness to pay. Will it expand sufficiently to actually drive the expansion that Climeworks has shown in its presentation?
Thanks, Axel. I currently don't see any hands. I would just take the opportunity to, I'll come to you after then.
Matthias?
Yeah.
Can I add to this?
Sure, yeah, sure.
Thank you. Since this was about us and our credits, I would like to add to this if I may. So, as I said in my initial statement, we do want this to go to unavoidable emissions. So we choose our clients carefully. Again, we are in the luxurious situation to be able to do that at the moment because it is a seller's market and will likely remain so. Just let me say one thing. Obviously, any oil company can do this, but as I said, we're chasing 420 parts per million, and that comes at a cost. And at current cost, that would raise the price of a barrel of oil to around $600. this is the cost of the cleanup. Obviously, that will go down, and maybe in the future it is a feasible economic prospect. But at the moment, everybody I think has to decide for themselves if that makes sense.
Thanks. So I'll very briefly take the chair's prerogative and ask a question to Helga on the role that direct air capture and storage takes in Icelandic society. Is this something that you would say Icelanders are proud to be at the cutting edge, at the globally leading edge of this technology? Is there a sort of identification among the Icelandic society with this technology? Or would you say right now this is still very much under the radar? It's not very much considered at all? Because of course you see the international community looking at your country in a sense and with great hopes. So how do you see this?
Thank you. A good question. Before I come to the question, I would like to thank you, Axel, for the presentation on the possibilities regarding Article 6. But I have to stress that the Government of Iceland and Switzerland haven't done any agreement yet. So this was all theoretical. But we have signed this letter of intent where we state that we will explore the possibilities. But I don't recall that ICMOS is mentioned anywhere, but Article 6.2, of course, so probably I could relate to it later on. So, but just to have that clear, the government hasn't set firm policy on it, but we are exploring it, and of course, that's it's a big issue. Regarding direct air capture, I think what the public of Iceland is more aware of is the Carbfix project, and all the polls that have been done where they ask of the opinion of the Carbfix and what Carbfix is doing have been up until now at least very positive. So, but I don't think that direct air capture is a big part of the question yet, but it might be, of course. And what I can say, just to stress that direct air capture can't replace robust mitigation actions. So just we can't let that can't be the discussion. Thank you.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, as Helga referred to, the Icelandic public has been very accepting of our technology. They followed us, supported us from the very beginning, and of course excited about what we're doing with Climeworks. And Icelanders are a bit naive in the sense that when the world is looking upon us, it feels good. So, and of course the world is looking upon us when it comes to direct air capture and storage. But coming maybe a bit back to the previous question, I do think it is important that if we are to scale up rapidly, we must have the public with us. And therefore, we have to be careful. All of these mechanisms, they have to make sense. We have to build them up in such a way that it's not greenwashing. So I would, without having a concrete solution on how we tackle this, we have to make sure that the public wants these projects, preferably in their backyard, but if not, at least not in the too distant, not too far away. So I do think this is something that we have to keep in mind when we create these frameworks that we are going to implement when it comes to Article 6, for example. And then also for the full value chain, what does it mean for the different players to make sure that we sort of have the perspective of all the different players in the value chain, please.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, gentlemen in the check.
Yes, hi, Will Carton, University. Thanks for the presentation. I was wondering, so is there any direct, so I mean to your point of like, making sure that there's enough public acceptance of this, is there any direct monitoring that you do to kind of be able to demonstrate the permanence of this, or what's the kind of, yeah, I mean, what kind of monitoring is in place? Because then, in order to scale that, what monitoring would need to be in place to be able to look to, the market and being compliant with, Article 6.2. Thank you.
I'm not sure whether you're asking how we monitor the level of public opinion or how we monitor the mineralization of the CO2.
Well, the mineralization. So, I mean, the actual, sequestration of.
Well, that's when the chemistry comes in again. So we monitor it very closely, and we use geochemistry, geochemical signals, or tracers, and we have monitoring wells and take samples and do a thorough mass balance calculation. And this is what we've done very thoroughly from the very beginning, and we've been very open with the data that we've collected. Over 100 peer-reviewed papers have been published, and you can find all of this on our website, all the ins and outs of how we do it.
So just continuing the topic of the public views on this. With Article 6.4, I'm aware that some environmental NGOs are not keen on engineered TPR being included compared to nature-based solutions. And I've seen it reported in UK, it's been reported in EMB even. And I'm just curious as to why they might have a position against TPR that has permanent removal compared to nature-based solutions that do not have permanent removal.
Yeah, just to answer on this, of course you've seen the removal paper that came out of the supervisory body. It has a provision that states you need to monitor first, and then you have so-called observed events. And if such observed event, for example, a forest fire or a well explosion or whatever happens, then this needs to be taken up and deducted. The problem is nobody has defined what actually characterizes such an observed event. Nobody has characterized exactly the duration of the monitoring. And as far as I see the negotiation dynamics, the CMA seems to be willing to reject actually this recommendation by the supervisory body. So it's clear there's a lot of debate about the issue of permanence, and we are not yet at the situation where there's universal agreement how to address it. What is of course clear is that here we have a kind of gold standard of permanence that probably no other storage methodology can achieve.
I'd like to add a non-technical answer, and I think a lot of these concerns are often associated with just analogies or images that people have. Sometimes they're not necessarily tied into the technicalities of what's actually happening. For example, oftentimes technological removals, as a broad umbrella term, are associated with what sometimes was referred to as geoengineering in the past. And it's a bit weird to see this because, of course, what we are doing, or what these companies are doing, is actually incremental. It's not in the sense large scale as is part of that geoengineering definition, but nonetheless people have this association, and so they are concerned about these topics. At the same time, what's interesting now is quite a bit of a pushback from perhaps a bit more informed organizations who see nature-based solutions, and I put this sometimes in inverted commas, because this is now starting to be seen more critically. I think rightly so. There's very important things to be done in that area, but just because something is perceived as natural does not mean that it is good in and of itself. So a bit more nuance is needed, and I think we see some of that discussion evolve over time. But I also saw that there was a further addition to this question.
Thank you. I just wanted to make a comment that is the question of what is nature-based and what is technology. I mean, I would argue that our technology is nature-based. You know, we simply use technology to facilitate natural mechanisms. And technology is used in planting trees and making that happen faster. So it's not this black and white, but this is absolutely a topic that needs addressing. But I would argue that our type of technology should absolutely be included under the mechanism.
Since we're all adding, I'll also add something. I just wanted to remind us that, you know, the planet we're currently living on, you know, we're approaching 10 billion people, and I personally am very doubtful that we can run this without technology, because in our, what we are doing, you know, we're trading renewable energy, which is the energy we do this with for space, right? So to achieve 6 gigatons of removal, you would need 3 planets of current tree coverage if you wanted to do it with afforestation. But we can shrink that to the 20% of the surface area of Iceland. That includes, you know, the solar. If you do it with solar panels, the area that these need, and that's about 97%. Obviously, if we do it with geothermal, that surface area shrinks even further. And this is precisely the reason why we do need this interplay between, you know, emissions reductions, and then, you know, we need to use all the biomass we can use for removals and have for removals, and obviously try and create more. But this is still not enough, and that's what the scenarios show. And this is why we, you know, here today, why we're advocating for speeding this up, because it takes time to develop the technologies. This doesn't work overnight. You know, in an integrated assessment model, if you tweak the numbers, you get more removals. But, you know, we need to hire the people. We need to, you know, R&D the technology, and you know, get 2 gigatons, say, is a long way. It's already a 60% scale-up rate we need for all the removals for these 6 gigatons, and that doesn't happen overnight.
So the conversation has thus far been, can you hear me? Has mostly been about financing these projects with voluntary carbon credit purchases, and the great work from perspectives on how mechanically you could actually execute that. But we know from the Working Group 3 report that the consensus is that climate solutions are scaled when they have deployment incentives, right? When lots of public money goes into the long-term downcosting of those new technologies, as we saw with solar and wind. So my question for anyone is, do you agree with that assessment? Do you think that focus on deployment incentives is really where we should be focusing our policy advocacy efforts at Carbon Cap and elsewhere? And second, if you want to comment specifically on the deployment incentives in the US, the $180 a ton for the 45Q tax credit, the process that's emerging in the UK, what do you think about that and the business models that the UK wants to put in place? And also, what do you think about the EU carbon contracts for difference? So where should we be focusing? How do we quickly get away from solely relying on voluntary carbon credit purchases, although great that it's working and that it's able to finance these early plants? Thank you.
Yes, let me just look at the international aspect of that. Of course, as I said, currently we have the voluntary carbon market niche, but it will not be able to mobilize large quantities. So eventually I would hope we see a blending of instruments, that we see government subsidies, but that these government subsidies are not so lavish that we have the same problem with wind industry in Germany, where the subsidy was so high that there was no incentive to bring the cost down. So ideally the subsidy would be below the current cost, and then one could have an increment that would be covered, for example, by the carbon market, and we would have an incentive to bring the costs down. That would pass to Matthias regarding the domestic policies.
Thanks, Axel. Let me first ask into the room, is the little box with the sample, has it made the rounds? It's back there? It's there? Okay, excellent. With that on policies, so one of the challenges with carbon markets is that they fluctuate in price naturally, that is in their nature. I think there's a bit of a hesitancy towards relying on market revenues for creating bankable investments projects, and so perhaps there is really a space in which governments in plural can step in and devise well, instruments that give some certainty, and part of this can take different shapes, and I think very much depends on domestic legal structures, whether this is possible or whether it might require collaboration with the private sector to devise financial instruments that provide such guarantees. But this is definitely a space that needs exploration, and that can in fact complement carbon markets. So yeah, I'd say at this early stage there's definitely a need for greater stability. But I hear additions from.
Yeah, thank you. Maybe so to add on to this from our perspective, we are obviously very, very grateful that the US has these government programs, you know, the 45Q tax credit and the direct air capture, the 3.5 billion program. This, you know, would have been unthinkable a few years ago. They were in the tens of millions, and now they are in the billions. But this is also needed because this is a capital-intensive thing to do. We're chasing 420 parts per million here, and you know, this needs to become literally one of the largest industries on the planet. You know, the cleanup has to be the size of the polluting, and you know, this is also when we're thinking about our scale-up roadmap, and I think the same is true for Carbfix. You know, we're looking already heavily into the US. We've opened in the US, and we're obviously looking for projects in the US as well, and obviously in many other places.
Yeah, just to follow up on that, I mean, it's obviously what, you know, the IRA and what's been coming out from the US, it's tremendous. It's really helping to take the next scale-up step. So whatever more, you know, other governments can do similar to that, obviously would be very beneficial. But then it's also obviously the private sector that will have to follow. So thank you.
Maybe one thing I would like to say, just 20 seconds. I think what's important to realize for governments is, you know, often in climate diplomacy we talk about burden sharing and the cost of these things. But in a world where, you know, some industries have to decline, you know, these represent industries that have to grow and bring economic revenue to your country. And I think the US is a country that has realized that along with the UK. So this is an opportunity to create jobs and you know, enable a clean tech economy in your country.
Thank you very much for an excellent panel. My name is Celine Bass. I'm from Emissions Reduction Alberta. I wonder if Edda and Christoph, you could give us a summary of the cost curve predictions that you have for 2030, 2035, and 2040. How big would the contracts for difference need to be given the current cost curve situation and the fiscal advantages and programs that are in place?
I can start here. Thank you for the question. Obviously, you know, predictions are difficult. What I can say is we are at 600 to 800 cost at the moment. Iceland is our reference point for direct air capture and storage because this is where we have done the projects. As we move into the US, the energy cost is a bit higher. Obviously, then we do have the 45Q and the DOE DSE hub programs to potentially balance that out. And then from there on, it really depends on you know, how quickly we can realize the bigger projects and then innovation. So one step is clearly to make the plants bigger. You know, if we apply for the DSE hubs, it has to go to 1 million tons, so that's might bring costs down considerably, but I don't think substantially, because then we need to automate the production process. The next step that is going to bring the cost down is, you know, creating better sorbent materials. We have, you know, the largest test center in our company, and the quicker we can, you know, run these different, you know, sorbents and deploy them in the field, the more the cost will come down. And the rest then is, you know, improvement of the process itself and obviously energy costs. We assume a learning rate of 12%, so we're not we're very conservative here, and also we only assume a lifetime of 12 years for the cost of our plants. Usually, in similar, in inverted commas, industries, plants that run for 20, 25, 30 years, but we don't want to use that because we simply don't know yet, so we always err on the side of caution here, and that reflects in the cost.
I already mentioned our current cost ranging from somewhere between $5 to $25 per ton, which is already cost competitive. Obviously, with more projects scaling up the technology, we expect those to go down. What exactly the number will be, the years you mentioned, it's extremely difficult to predict because it also relies heavily on the location of each project, the energy cost, and so forth. But obviously we are ambitious. We want to see it go down, whether it's 20% or more. I mean, we'll have to see.
Thank you. We have about time for another 1 or 2 questions. There's one in the corner.
Yeah. Hello. My question, I have 2 questions in fact. The IPCC in its latest report has shown that there is a large amount of geological storage, but the sustainable storage, CCS, availability is quite low if you take into account transport or the environmental impacts and also energy, things like that, infrastructure which is needed. So when you say there's limited storage, I just wanted to know if this is geological or sustainable storage capacity. And I have a second question, sorry. The other one was when you choose your clients, you said that you only choose those who want to avoid residual emissions or unavoidable emissions that cannot be abated. But what does it mean, cannot be abated? For example, there are a lot of methods. For example, if we decrease the methane emissions by eating less meat, methane is difficult to avoid, but if we change our habits, then it would be avoidable. So it's like mitigation deterrence would result from new technology. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to start with the second question, if I may, and then we move into the first question and over to Edda. So what I say is, because this is a seller's market, there are less removals than there is demand. We are able to choose our clients. Obviously, the question, what do unavoidable emissions mean, is not the question that we will answer. And this question is still an open question, right? It's the same as, who has to neutralize historic emissions. I just try to point out that, we as a company, try to be responsible here in the best knowledge, in the absence of a standard of unavoidable emissions. And as to behavioral changes, again, as a company, we wouldn't comment on that. Obviously, I personally, for example, have reduced my emissions quite substantially, and this is something in the democratic system that is up to the individual person, I believe. And what we do is we offer solutions to make conscious choices, because there's a cost to that, to maybe continue some of the things you want to do. So, for example, the example I gave earlier, where I said, currently to remove the emissions of kerosene, that would raise the price of oil, that would raise, for example, the price of kerosene considerably. But there's no alternative to kerosene for long distance flying. So, but it offers you a way to do it and to pay for the cleanup at the same time. And I think that's the mindset we are in.
For storage, I mentioned that there is way more storage than will ever be needed. That's the geology. That's how much the geologic formations can actually store. Obviously, building the infrastructure, defining the ins and outs of how each project will be built and operated, that's an engineering task, which of course will exclude some of the upper limit of the geologic capacity. But still, since it is orders of magnitude larger than we will need for climate action, looking way into the future, I do believe it is absolutely a doable task to build up the capacity to meet the targets that we have set for ourselves. But it's not going to be easy, but it can absolutely be done.
Actually, I think we have run out of time. We have to leave the room. Exactly, we have to be out of the room now. But I just want to thank you all for coming. We have here new technology. It's clear that the framework, the legal framework, we have to run a bit faster within the administration to keep all the laws and regulations in check, so the new technology can purpose and so. But we are running fast, maybe not fast enough, but we are trying. So thank you all for coming and have a good day.